as we got caught up in the bursting of the housing bubble and then the financial crisis and then this extraordinary response that occurred with the bailouts of the investment banks and all the other things that were unprecedented historically and that caused so much frustration, I realized that, it appeared we were moving into an environment in terms of government involvement in the system, bailouts, the Federal Reserve responses to these different things that was unlike anything that had happened in my lifetime, and I needed to dig in.
You're listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, where you get valuable information you just can't find anywhere else. To thrive in today's trying times, you need the Financial Survival Network, now more than ever. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and get your free newsletter and gift. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.
And welcome. You are listening to and watching the Financial Survival Network. I'm your host, Kerry Lutz. Well, hard to believe, 2008, the last global financial crisis, and it's been 16 years. Maybe it's time for a look back, because certainly one of the major issues during this campaign season was housing affordability, and housing affordability has never been more out of reach for more people than it is now. So the book is 2008, What Really Happened. Todd Sheets, author, is with us now. Todd, you just released this book a month ago. What was the reason you wrote the book?
Yeah, well, so the reason that I wrote the book was as we got caught up in the bursting of the housing bubble and then the financial crisis and then this extraordinary response that occurred with the bailouts of the investment banks and all the other things that were unprecedented historically and that caused so much frustration, I realized that, it appeared we were moving into an environment in terms of government involvement in the system, bailouts, the Federal Reserve responses to these different things that was unlike anything that had happened in my lifetime. And I needed to dig in and start doing a lot more research so I understood the history and what really caused this event, and then also understood the historical history behind the event as well. And so, that led to a number of years of researching these things and then the process of putting the book together.
All right. So what do you think we've learned in the past 16 years? I know what you've learned, but what do you think the rest of us have learned?
Well, I think, unfortunately, we kind of ended up as a whole taking away the wrong messages from what happened. The dominant narrative that evolved was the idea that this occurred because of what I call in the book a gradual trend of deregulation, with the idea being that this went back to the late Carter years and then the Reagan administration. We went down this deregulatory trend across a range of different industries, and that eventually it spun out of control and it just went too far, and that allowed markets to spin out of control, which then created a housing bubble and then a panic. And as I got into the research on all of this, what I saw is basically what really happened could not have been further from that understanding. And, the things that actually caused the housing bubble that led to the crisis, and then even the panic and the crisis itself, were driven by factors, that were completely the opposite of this general understanding that occurred.
All right. So nobody really understood what was happening. The deregulation was definitely a factor. The ability to raise interest rates as high as you wanted, getting rid of all the usury laws, combined with that, I'm sure was a factor. But it was a lack of understanding also on the part of consumers, homeowners, when they signed on the dotted line, what the effects of these refinancings and negative interest, negative amortization mortgages and adjustable mortgages and all this type of stuff, what that would actually how it would wind up affecting you.
No question. I mean, there was confusion throughout the system, a failure to understand and anticipate what was happening at the time. And then, as we've talked about, even in the aftermath. So, at the time, what I show in the book is what actually caused the housing bubble was the major expansion undertaken by the two government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that by the mid-1990s, for the first time ever, had come to dominate housing finance in a way that was unique in our country's history. We had always had very predictable, reliable housing markets. It was thought of as like a cornerstone of wealth for most young families or young people starting out in life. Go out and buy a home, and if you hold it over time, it will grow in value, not rapidly, but at a reasonable pace. And that housing was generally safe from the kinds of booms and busts that we've seen in other areas of the economy. And that was basically true. That also is reflected in the housing data that goes back to the 1880s. But what changed kind of beneath the radar was that beginning in the early 1970s, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which became private institutions traded on the New York Stock Exchange, but ones that were also given special government privileges that allowed Washington to continue to play a role in housing finance, they started to grow. And by the mid-90s, they were getting close to the point, not quite, but close to the point where they were responsible for almost $1 out of every $2 of single-family mortgage finance in this country. So when in 1998, they undertook a massive expansion of their businesses, and it was massive and sudden. The year before, they had grown by something like 6 or 7%. In 1998, they grew by around 15%, and they continued to grow at that rate for the next 4 years. All of a sudden, what we see in the national data is an extraordinary and unprecedented escalation in housing prices that began to take place at that point in time. And so that started luring people into this idea that, hey, housing, is not just a get rich slow mechanism. It's something that people can make some real money on in the short term as well.
Right. So when you look at it also, one of the things one of the things you think about with a housing crisis, right, is that, AIG, their failure. And when you go back to AIG, it's so funny. A large reason of why AIG failed was because the then Attorney General, who later on became the disgraced, governor of New York, none other than Andy Cuomo, actually caused this guy who is very conservative. He would have never done all these collateral default CDOs and CMOs, but because Cuomo pushed him out, I think his name was Greenberg, wound up the new leadership of AIG was very reckless, and they did all sorts of things that Hank Greenberg would have never done.
Yes. I mean, look, we saw this kind of throughout the spectrum from home buyers who were taking on obligations that they didn't fully understand and appreciate the risks of, to financial institutions that were providing loans under terms and buying and accumulating, in some cases, fairly exotic mortgage securities that, like the ones you referenced, or just making regular home loans and maintaining a piece of the securitizations on their books. We saw it, AIG, as you referenced, Merrill Lynch had significant problems in the fourth quarter of 2007. Citigroup had similar problems. Both situations, of 2007. In both situations, longtime CEOs were fired from those institutions as well. And as you go back through it, the thing that connected all of these institutions as the dominoes started to fall, all of which started to happen after the housing bubble began to collapse. But the thing that linked all these institutions together was exposure in some form to single-family home mortgages, whether it was securitization pieces they retained on their books or through the kinds of instruments that you just referenced at AIG and others as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty amazing. So do you think that we can have another crash like we did before because we don't have liar's loans? They have done a number of things to stop it from happening. There's Dodd-Frank, which the Fed has showed that they won't enforce unless it's against a small bank, not against a big bank, right? All these things.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, look, we have learned some lessons. I think the regulators did learn some lessons in that respect. And maybe more importantly, the lenders learned some lessons in this respect. I mean, we now know we can have a national housing bubble. Prices nationally, can decline by 20-25% like they did after the bubble collapsed. So there is less recklessness on the lending side of things. But I think because we didn't draw the proper lessons from the last from the housing bubble and the financial crisis, we now have different problems. So we followed all of that up. I mean, the first phase of the housing bubble was created by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as I talked about in the book, from 98 through 2001. But from 2002 to 2005, the bubble was really driven by easy money, low interest rate policies of the Federal Reserve. When they lowered interest rates after the tech bubble collapsed in 2000 to try and protect the economy, they did not realize that they were making the historic mistake of pushing short-term interest rates down below the rate of housing appreciation, which caused an incredible sense of opportunity to make money quickly by borrowing it on adjustable rate mortgages and buying a home that was appreciating at, let's say, 5, 6, 7%, and financing it with a loan that was,
Right.
On a variable rate short-term basis, maybe had a 3 to 4% interest rate kind of thing. So because of all that and failing to learn the proper lessons, we came out of the crisis with the Fed continuing to engage in very easy money, low interest rate policies throughout the period of time after that. And we've kind of gone through another round of asset inflation. So housing prices are very high again. Getting back to your question, I don't think we're necessarily poised for another collapse because of the change in the lending markets that you alluded to, but we have a massive affordability issue right now. And that, I think, played a big role in this past election. And it's also a part of, this bout of inflation that frustrated so many people in the last 4 years as well. It wasn't just in consumer prices for a period of time, but it also came in housing prices and priced a lot of people out of the marketplace. So it doesn't have to necessarily have the same end, but we have, a kind of a different set of problems that have arisen this time.
So, the crash, if there is a crash in housing, it's not going to be because of fraud and liar's loans, as they called it. It's going to be from something more structural and less intentional, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's likely. I mean, we don't have to have a crash. I mean, the other option is that we go through what sometimes gets called a lost decade or a lost 2 decades of return. So people come in and buy a home at these very high prices that we now have as a result of all of this. But instead of getting the kind of predictable 3-4% growth in the value of the home over time, the home values just stagnate for 10 or 15 years. And so, that if people are aware of that, then maybe that gets them to look a little bit more closely at a rent versus buy decision and think more about whether, do I really want to take on home ownership and all of that if I don't think I'm going to make much money out of the home over the next 10 to 15 years? So,
Yes. And that really is the problem is, we've seen home prices escalate so far, so fast, even faster than the rate of inflation, whatever that actual rate might be. And we don't really know what that rate is. We only know the government numbers, which we know from past experience, we should accept with a grain of salt, right? So even if they don't go up, many people who've bought into American Dream, buy your home, hold on to it, get another, blah, 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 watch the price go up. They might be in for a disappointment, huh?
Yeah, for a disappointment in the case of, like we just talked about, a lost decade of appreciation, but also the risk that they should be aware of is you got to be very careful about how much leverage you would buy a home at at this point in time. Or if you're thinking you already own a home that's appreciated a lot, and maybe you're thinking about taking out an equity loan or a reverse mortgage or something like that, people should be very cautious about the use of debt against these current home values, because there is a risk, like we've talked about in one scenario, of failure to appreciate, but there's also a risk of another downturn in housing prices, which, obviously is going to hurt the people with the most leverage most quickly. So all of these things are things to be aware of.
All right. Well, hey, we really appreciate you coming in on the show, Todd, sounding the alarm here, because I think better safe than sorry. Forewarned is forearmed. The name of the book, 2008, What Really Happened. Written by Todd Sheets, who's on with us now, and you can find it on Amazon. There's a link to the Amazon purchase page in the show notes to this interview on financialsurvivalnetwork.com. We ask while you're there, you please sign up for our newsletter. Like over 60,000 FSN members have already done so. Todd will we'll be looking at what happens, and if there's any major signs, reverberations in the market, we'll be sure to have you back on. Good luck with the book, and we'll talk to you soon.
That sounds so great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Kerry Lutz's Financial Survival Network, your solution to today's trying times. For the latest, go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com. Financial Survival Network, now more than ever.